A couple of years ago, I recorded an item for Top Gear in which I quoted the rhyme "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo." Now, of course, I was well aware that in the best-known version of this rhyme there is a racist expression that I was extremely keen to avoid. That I'd actually used the word I was trying to obscure, and that I'm sitting here begging your forgiveness.
Sunday nights in Britain belonged to one man. Millions settled onto their sofas, week after week, for the spectacle of fast cars, dangerous pranks, and the magnetic, infuriating swagger of Jeremy Clarkson. Top Gear wasn't just a television program. It had become a cultural institution, watched in over 170 countries by an estimated 350 million people every single week. But while the cameras rolled and the tires screamed, something was quietly rotting underneath it all. Behind the record-breaking viewing figures and the billion-dollar brand, Clarkson's personal world was collapsing in slow motion. His marriage, the one constant through decades of fame, was dissolving. The tabloid press smelled blood, affair rumors, racial controversies, a war with his BBC bosses, the death of his mother. Each crisis arrived before the previous one had even healed, and then came the punch heard round the world. What happens when the loudest, most defiant man on British television loses control of the one thing no amount of horsepower can outrun: his own private life? This is the full, unfiltered story of how Jeremy Clarkson's personal collapse nearly burned down the most successful motoring franchise in television history. Welcome to the largest car TV show channel on YouTube. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Now let's get into it. To understand how far Clarkson fell, you first have to understand where he started, and how unlikely his rise was to begin with. Jeremy Charles Robert Clarkson was born on April 11, 1960, in Doncaster, South Yorkshire, to parents who were about as far removed from television glamour as it is possible to be. His father, Edward, sold tea cozies for a living. His mother, Shirley, was a school teacher. They weren't wealthy, but they were ambitious for their son. Ambitious enough to put his name down at several boarding schools before he was old enough to understand what school was. He ended up at Repton, a prestigious private school in Derbyshire whose alumni include Roald Dahl and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Clarkson, characteristically, distinguished himself through misbehavior rather than academic achievement. He was eventually expelled for, in his own words, excessive high spirits, a euphemism that would follow him throughout his entire career. One of his Repton classmates, incidentally, was Adrian Newey, who went on to become arguably the most successful aerodynamicist in Formula One history. Even at school, Clarkson was surrounded by people destined for greatness. He just had a different idea of what greatness should look like. After being shown the door at Repton, Clarkson did what any rebellious teenager with a famous school on his CV might do. He went to work for his parents, selling Paddington Bear toys. The career didn't last. What did last was his obsession with writing. He trained as a journalist with the Rotherham Advertiser, then bounced around regional newspapers, the Rochdale Observer, the Wolverhampton Express and Star, Lincolnshire Life. He later said his first proper motoring column appeared in the Shropshire Star, where he reviewed modest little Peugeots and Fiats. "It was 10 years before I was allowed near an Aston Martin," he once reflected. The waiting, it turned out, was good for him. In 1984, Clarkson co-founded the Motoring Press Agency, a small outfit that supplied car reviews and motoring content to newspapers and magazines. It was the kind of low-glamour grinding work that most people never see behind a media career. Endless test drives, tight deadlines, editors who didn't care what he thought of a car's gear ratios. But it got him noticed. Soon he was writing for The Sun and the Sunday Times, publications with national reach, and his opinionated, combative style was drawing readers who didn't even particularly care about cars. Then came Top Gear. The show had been running since 1977 in various forms. A consumer car program, sensible and functional, aimed at motorists who wanted honest advice about reliability and running costs. It was, in the kindest possible terms, not exciting. Clarkson began appearing as a contributor in the late 1980s. injecting some personality into what was otherwise a fairly dry format. By 1991, he had become the show's main host, and the transformation had begun. The original Clarkson-era Top Gear was canceled in 1999, partly because Clarkson himself had grown tired of Birmingham, where it filmed, describing the city publicly as the armpit that masquerades as Britain's second city. He also briefly hosted his own chat show, Clarkson, on BBC Two, an odd venture that featured him goading celebrities and performing stunts with microwaves. It wasn't his finest hour, but in 2002, Top Gear was relaunched with a new format, a new track in Surrey, and 3 permanent presenters: Clarkson, Richard Hammond, and, arriving slightly later in 2003, James May. The chemistry between the 3 was, by any objective measure, a once-in-a-generation accident. They shouldn't have worked. Clarkson was loud, May was glacially precise, Hammond was excitable, and mildly competitive about everything. Together, they were television gold. Within 5 years, Top Gear had become the most-watched factual television program on the planet. Not the most-watched car show, the most-watched factual program, full stop. 350 million viewers, 170 countries, a live arena touring show that sold out stadiums, a magazine, a merchandising empire. Clarkson wasn't just a TV presenter anymore. He was a global brand, worth tens of millions of pounds and showing no signs of slowing down. For all his on-screen bravado, the engine quietly keeping Clarkson's professional life functioning was Frances Cain, the woman he married in 1993. Frances wasn't a show business figure. Before she became Clarkson's manager, she had been working as a redundancy counselor, helping other people navigate job loss while driving a Volkswagen Golf GTI and renting her own flat. She was self-sufficient, practical, and possessed of a quiet organizational intelligence that Clarkson, for all his bluster, clearly needed around him. They had first crossed paths through social circles and began a relationship that led to marriage in 1993, settling eventually into a comfortable family home in Chipping Norton, in the Oxfordshire Cotswolds, an area that would later become famous as the hub of what the press called the Chipping Norton set, a loose cluster of media figures and politicians who shared the same postcode and, apparently, each other's company at dinner parties. Frances took on the management of Clarkson's career, a role she carried out largely invisible to the public. Those who worked around the couple described her as the steady hand that kept his professional commitments organized, his finances structured, and his ego, occasionally, in check. They had 3 children together, Emily, Finlo, and Katya, and by all visible measures, built a life together that looked, from the outside, remarkably solid. Friends noted that Frances had a particular understanding of what made Clarkson tick. She bought him car-themed gifts, engaged with his enthusiasms rather than tolerating them, and managed the administrative complexity of a TV career that operated at a scale most people in the industry had never seen. For 21 years, she made that work. But 21 years is a long time to share a life with someone whose job description includes being adored by millions of strangers, traveling the world at high speed, and surrounded constantly by production crews, PR people, and an entourage that exists to make him feel indispensable. The slow pressure of that life, the absences, the chaos, the constant external noise, wore at things that looked solid from a distance. The first public suggestion that Clarkson's marriage was in trouble came in 2002, when tabloid reports alleged a romantic involvement with Elaine Bedell, a television producer and journalist. The stories were never confirmed, and Clarkson said nothing publicly to address them, but they established a pattern that the press would return to again and again. More damaging, and far more public, was what happened in 2011. During the frantic Top Gear live arena tours, enormous, logistically complex productions staged in stadiums across the world, Clarkson grew close to a colleague, Philippa Sage, an events planner who worked alongside the Top Gear production team. The tabloids alleged an affair. Both Clarkson and Sage denied it. Sage called the suggestion nonsense, adding that she and Clarkson were simply friends who had worked together for years. But in 2013, the pair were photographed kissing in public. the denials became impossible to sustain. Frances, who by several accounts had endured years of her husband's long absences and occasional indiscretions, while quietly keeping everything together at home, had reached the end of her tolerance. She moved out of the family home in early 2014. A mutual friend later told reporters that Frances's circle had been urging her to leave for years. When the split was finally confirmed, she reportedly celebrated by flying to Mallorca with friends for what sources described as a jolly, boozy holiday. Not the behavior of a woman in mourning, but of one who had been waiting for this moment. After 21 years of marriage, Clarkson and Frances formally separated in May 2014 and subsequently divorced. The financial settlement was, predictably, substantial. One Telegraph source said Frances deserved every penny for what she had endured over 2 decades. She was not wrong. The story didn't end with Frances either. It emerged that Clarkson had briefly rekindled something with his first wife, Alexandra James, to whom he had been married for barely a year back in 1989, before the relationship collapsed almost immediately. Alexandra, who had become friends with Frances, allegedly carried on an affair with Jeremy that lasted nearly a decade. Clarkson denied the claims forcefully enough to file a high court injunction against Alexandra when she spoke publicly about it. His legal team characterized her statements as blackmail. Alexandra alleged that Clarkson had offered her the equivalent of around £360,000 to stay quiet. Whatever the truth of that particular chapter, it added another layer of complexity to an already complicated picture of a marriage under sustained assault from multiple directions. For her part, Philippa Sage, who dated Clarkson from around the time of his separation until 2017, later spoke movingly about how the relationship ended. "Jeremy was the love of my life, and I thought it would be forever," she told the Mirror. The combined weight of their breakup, her father's illness, and the chaos surrounding Clarkson's departure from Top Gear, she said, caused her the worst breakdown of her life. Truly the lowest point, she called it. The divorce was devastating enough on its own. What made 2014 and early 2015 so particularly brutal was that everything else collapsed at the same time. Clarkson's on-screen controversies had been escalating for years. His humor operated right at the edge of what was acceptable, and occasionally, quite deliberately, stepped over it. The BBC had been receiving complaints about Clarkson for most of his career, and had developed something of a policy of issuing warnings, accepting apologies, and hoping the next controversy would be less severe than the last. In 2014, that policy began to crumble. A Top Gear Burma special aired with a segment in which Clarkson described a bridge as having a slope on it, a phrase that Ofcom ruled was a deliberate racial slur directed at an Asian bridge worker visible in the shot. The ruling was unambiguous. Then footage leaked of a production outtake in which Clarkson appeared to mumble the N-word while reciting the children's rhyme, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo," the very incident referenced at the opening of this video. He begged forgiveness publicly and sincerely. The BBC issued a formal warning. Clarkson later revealed that the personal context surrounding that second controversy was, by his own description, almost unbearably heavy. His mother, Shirley, died in March 2014. She had been one of the constants of his life, the teacher who had pushed him academically when he was getting expelled from boarding school, the woman whose approval had mattered to him even through decades of fame. She was gone just days before the outtake footage became public. "I said, 'My mother's just died. Please leave me alone,'" he recalled of his conversations with BBC management during that period. But they wouldn't. He confided the full extent of his situation to Piers Morgan, a rival turned friend, as complicated relationships in British media often are, over drinks at a London pub. The conversation has since become one of the more extraordinary self-portraits of a man in crisis that has ever been reported. "I'm going through a difficult divorce," Clarkson told Morgan. "My first ex-wife has come out of the woodwork to give me hell. I'm smoking too much, drinking too much. My back hurts. I'm all over the papers with this N-word scandal. I'm at war with my BBC bosses, and my mother has just died." It's worth sitting with that list for a moment. That is not a rough patch. That is a sustained assault on every aspect of a person's life, arriving all at once, with cameras watching and tabloids taking notes. Even so, Clarkson kept showing up. Top Gear continued filming. He gave interviews, appeared at events, maintained the persona, but the armor was visibly cracking. Philippa Sage, who was living through her own turmoil during this period, described the entire Top Gear inner circle as burned out. The pressure was systemic, not just personal. And there was one more thing that nobody knew at the time. 2 days before the incident that would end his BBC career, Clarkson visited his doctor. A lump had appeared on his tongue. The doctor told him, in no uncertain terms, that it was probably cancer and that he needed to get it checked out immediately. Clarkson chose not to. Top Gear was mid-series. The schedule was too tight. He would later write about this decision with a kind of stunned retrospection, acknowledging that he simply filed the potential cancer diagnosis away and kept working. Top Gear always came first, he wrote. Even then. The lump turned out to be benign. He got the all-clear weeks later. But the fact that he was carrying a suspected cancer diagnosis into the events of March 2015, telling nobody, carrying on, says something about the state of a man who was, by any reasonable measure, running on empty. On the evening of March 4, 2015, Jeremy Clarkson returned to his hotel in North Yorkshire, where Top Gear was on location. He had been filming all day. He was hungry, tired, and expecting the steak dinner that had been arranged for the production team. There was no steak. What followed has gone down in television history as the Fracas, a word the BBC's own internal report used with straight-faced formality for what was, by any other description, a physical assault. Clarkson punched producer Ocean Timon in the face, splitting his lip. The attack lasted around 30 seconds. The verbal abuse that accompanied it was loud enough to be heard in the hotel's dining room from some distance away. Timon drove himself to A&E. The BBC suspended Clarkson on March 10th while it investigated. The fan response was extraordinary in scale and somewhat depressing in tone. Nearly 1 million people signed a petition demanding his reinstatement, as though the question of whether a man should face consequences for assaulting a colleague could be resolved by popular vote. Clarkson himself appeared briefly outside his London flat and said almost nothing. The swagger was completely absent. On March 25, 2015, BBC Director General Tony Hall announced what many had assumed was unthinkable. Jeremy Clarkson's contract would not be renewed. The BBC praised his talent and acknowledged his contribution, but Hall was clear that there was one standard of behavior that applied to everyone, regardless of how many viewers they brought in. A line has been crossed, he said. There cannot be one rule for one and one rule for another. After 27 years with the BBC, the first stint from 1988 to 1999, the second from 2002 to 2015, it was over. Richard Hammond and James May declined to continue Top Gear without Clarkson, which meant that in one stroke, the BBC had lost all 3 presenters of its most valuable global export. The new Top Gear, relaunched with Chris Evans and Matt LeBlanc, would struggle badly with critics and audiences before eventually finding more stable ground under a different presenting team. For Clarkson, the professional loss was as serious as the personal one. He later described Top Gear as absolutely my baby, something he had poured himself into, attended to in obsessive detail, and loved with a devotion that exceeded even his obvious financial interest in it. I worked all the time on it and paid attention to every little detail, he said. It was an all-consuming entity, a many-tentacled global monster that was dysfunctional and awkward and mad, but I loved it with a passion. I loved it like my own child. That sense of loss, visceral, genuinely felt, colored everything that followed. He later wrote, I felt sick because after I'd lost my home and my mother, I'd thrown myself even more vigorously into my job, and now, idiotically, I'd managed to lose that too. The day after his firing, photographers were waiting outside the bachelor flat in London that Clarkson had moved into after the family home in Chipping Norton went to Francis in the divorce settlement. The man who emerged looked nothing like the untouchable force of nature who had filled stadium arenas around the world. He was quieter. He looked older. He shouldered the blame without deflection. It was my own silly fault, he said, so I could hardly complain. That sentence, short, honest, stripped of any of his usual armor, was more revealing than anything he had said publicly in years. There was no reframing, no argument that he had been treated unfairly, no suggestion that the BBC had overreacted. He thanked the corporation for tolerating him for as long as it had. He called it a great organization. Behind closed doors, the emotional toll was, by his own and his friends' accounts, severe. His longtime producing partner Andy Willman described Clarkson in the weeks after the firing as genuinely depressed and uncertain about what came next. In a 2016 interview, attempting to discuss his late mother, Clarkson broke down in tears and then, true to form, immediately made a wildly inappropriate joke about it. It was painful to watch, in the way that watching someone desperately refuse to be seen as vulnerable is always painful. He summarized that year, 2014 to 2015, with the kind of compressed bluntness that occasionally escaped his more performed persona. In 1 year, I lost my mother, my house, my job. Then he changed the description in his Twitter biography to a single line: I used to be a presenter on the BBC Two motoring show Top Gear. What happened next was, by any measure, one of the most lucrative and improbable career resurrections in British television history. Within weeks of his firing, it became clear that streaming platforms and commercial broadcasters were not going to observe a polite period of mourning before approaching Clarkson and his co-hosts. The bidding war was intense. By mid-2015, Amazon Prime Video had signed all three, Clarkson, Hammond, and May, to produce a new motoring show under a new name, The Grand Tour. The financial terms were staggering. Reports at the time put the total budget at somewhere in the region of $250 million for the first 3 seasons, a figure that, if accurate, would have made it one of the most expensive television commissions in history at that point. Amazon, which was aggressively building its content library to compete with Netflix, understood that what it was buying wasn't just a car show. It was a relationship between 3 presenters and a global fan base that had proved impervious to scandal. At the press announcement in July 2015, some of the old Clarkson resurfaced. I feel like I've climbed out of a biplane and into a spaceship, he said, comparing his old BBC life to the freedom Amazon was offering. The photos from that day showed a man who looked, if not entirely unburdened, at least genuinely relieved to be working again. The Grand Tour launched in November 2016. It was an immediate hit. Amazon reported record viewing figures for its debut episode, though the platform famously does not release detailed audience data. The show retained the energy and chemistry of Top Gear while operating with a larger budget, fewer institutional constraints, and the freedom to be as outrageous as the trio wanted. For several seasons, it felt like a triumph. The fans had followed. The formula had survived the scandal. Clarkson himself seemed, in this period, to have processed something. The version of him that appeared on the Grand Tour was still provocative and often childish. He hadn't undergone a personality transplant, but the wild volatility of his worst years seemed to have receded. He appeared more settled. By 2017, he had entered a relationship with Lisa Hogan, an Irish-born actress he met through mutual friends, and the stability of that partnership was visible to those around him. The Grand Tour ran for 8 years in total, eventually transitioning from a series format to standalone specials, big-budget road trip films set in Madagascar, Colombia, Zimbabwe, lockdown-era Britain, and elsewhere. The final special, titled One for the Road, landed on Amazon Prime in 2024. It was a Zimbabwe road trip, and it was genuinely emotional, not just for the audience, many of whom had been watching Clarkson, Hammond, and May since the early 2000s, but seemingly for the 3 men themselves. Clarkson had announced his departure from the format publicly, telling the Sunday Times, "After 36 years of talking about cars on television, I'm packing it in, because I'm too old and fat to get into the cars that I like, and not interested in driving those I don't." He added, "What this means, of course, is that my 22-year partnership with James May and Richard Hammond is now over." Viewers watching the final special wept. The internet filled up with people posting about what the show had meant to them, getting through illness, bereavement, difficult periods, and thanking 3 men who had, by their own accounts, occasionally struggled to take anything seriously. The Reformation, it should be said, was not total. The old Clarkson was still capable of detonating at spectacular scale. In December 2022, in the wake of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's Netflix documentary, Clarkson wrote a column for The Sun that immediately became the most complained about article in the history of Ipso, the independent press standards organization, the body that oversees press conduct in the UK. The column, which Clarkson later described as a clumsy reference to a Game of Thrones scene that he forgot to contextualize, contained language about Meghan Markle so extreme that it generated more than 25,000 formal complaints, forced The Sun to issue a public apology and remove the article from its archive, drew condemnation from politicians across party lines, and prompted his own daughter Emily, a writer and podcast host who had carved out her own public profile, to post on social media that she stood against everything her father had written. That last detail was perhaps the most striking. Emily Clarkson's public criticism of her father's column was direct, clear, and not apologetic about the difficulty of the position. "My views are, and have always been clear when it comes to misogyny, bullying, and the treatment of women by the media," she wrote. It was a reminder that the private consequences of Jeremy Clarkson's public behavior extended beyond tabloid headlines to the people sitting across from him at family dinners. Clarkson eventually offered a more fulsome apology on Instagram, saying he had been in a hurry when he wrote the piece and had failed to read it back before submitting it, something he said he normally did. "I really am sorry," he wrote, "all the way from the balls of my feet to the follicles on my head." Prince Harry called the column horrific, hurtful, and cruel. A spokesperson for the couple called The Sun's apology a PR stunt. Ipso launched a formal investigation. The episode illustrated something that Clarkson's most devoted admirers sometimes prefer not to examine: that the post-BBC, post-divorce, Clarkson's farm version of the man had not entirely replaced the earlier model. The capacity for self-destruction was still there, still loaded, still occasionally pointed in the wrong direction. The truest change in Jeremy Clarkson didn't come from a streaming deal or a chat show contract. It came from 1,000 acres of Oxfordshire farmland and the profound humiliation of having absolutely no idea what he was doing. Clarkson had bought Diddley Squat Farm back in 2008, largely as an investment. For years it was leased to a local farmer who actually knew how to run it. Then, in 2019, that arrangement ended. Clarkson decided, with the same magnificent overconfidence he had once applied to building a Reliant Robin space shuttle, that he would run the farm himself. Clarkson's Farm, which debuted on Amazon Prime Video in June 2021, was the television series that resulted. It followed Clarkson and his eccentric, lovable supporting cast, principally the young farming contractor Caleb Cooper, who became one of the most unexpectedly beloved television personalities in recent memory, through the genuine chaos of attempting to run an agricultural operation without the relevant knowledge, skills, or physical constitution. Critics expected something light, a vanity project, a rich man playing at farming while a camera crew documented his incompetence. What they got was something considerably more interesting. Clarkson, stripped of the infrastructure of Top Gear, no producers handing him jokes, no script, no carefully arranged spectacle, was nakedly, visibly out of his depth. Crops failed, machinery broke down, weather destroyed months of work. He argued with planning authorities over his farm shop. He lost money in ways that visibly alarmed him, and in those moments of genuine struggle, something appeared on screen that had been largely invisible throughout his 3 decades of television. Vulnerability, empathy, the specific humility of a person who has to learn something from scratch. The moment that stopped viewers cold came when Clarkson had to make the decision to put down a sheep that had fallen seriously ill. He held the animal. He wept. There were no jokes, no deflection, no performance. It was a man in his 60s, in a muddy field, genuinely heartbroken over a sheep. Critics who had spent years dismissing him as a professional provocateur found themselves reassessing. Clarkson's Farm has shown a new, more empathetic side to an oft combative petrolhead, one reviewer noted, pointing out how the series had turned him into an unlikely champion for British farming and rural communities who felt overlooked and underrepresented in national conversation. The show became one of Amazon Prime's most watched original productions. It spawned genuine local celebrity. Caleb Cooper published a best-selling book, and Gerald Cooper, the elderly, near-incomprehensible village elder who appeared throughout, became a cult figure. The farm shop, Diddley Squat, became a destination. Planning rose between Clarkson and West Oxfordshire District Council over what he was allowed to sell became front-page news. Clarkson himself acknowledged the transformation with the straightforwardness that has always been his most genuinely appealing quality. "I've never been happier," he said one evening, standing on his land in muddy boots at sunset. For a man who had spent decades equating happiness with speed, noise, and horsepower, it was an admission that landed with unusual weight. By 2024, the life that Clarkson had been living for 6 decades, the smoking, the drinking, the relentless schedule, the stress, had accumulated to a point where his body could no longer be ignored. In October 2024, Clarkson was on holiday on a small island in the Indian Ocean when he noticed something was wrong. It happened gradually, then all at once, a phrase he borrowed from Hemingway when writing about it afterwards. He struggled to swim a short distance to a beach. He had to hold someone's hand to walk down a flight of stairs. He belly-flopped a dive he had performed dozens of times before. When he got home to England and the symptoms worsened, pins and needles in his left arm, a tightness across his chest, a clammy, wrong feeling he couldn't shake, he was taken by ambulance to the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford. The verdict was stark. One of the 3 arteries supplying blood to his heart was completely blocked. A second was heading rapidly in the same direction. A doctor told him he had been, possibly, days away from a fatal cardiac event. He was fitted with 2 stents in an emergency procedure and sent home the following morning. Here I am, 2 hours later, writing this and sort of thinking, "Crikey, that was close," he wrote in his Sunday Times column. The lifestyle advice that followed was, for a man whose entire public identity had been built around excess, essentially a sentence: no alcohol, no smoking, limited exertion. A diet that Clarkson described, with characteristic drama, as a liberal Democrat, holier-than-thou fog of weeds, seeds, and yoga. His doctor suggested he take up golf. A doctor who had met Jeremy Clarkson before would probably not have suggested golf. He recovered. He went back to the farm. Caleb Cooper told radio listeners that he checked in on Clarkson daily, going round for cups of tea and to make sure the patient was behaving himself. Then, in mid-2026, filming Season 5 of Clarkson's Farm, episodes shot across 2024 and 2025, came another revelation. Clarkson told his farm regulars, Caleb Cooper and farm manager Charlie Ireland, that he had undergone a biopsy and received a diagnosis of prostate cancer. The cancer was aggressive, he said, but had been caught early. "If this is all successful, I'll see you for Season 6, he told the camera. "And if it isn't, I won't. Take care, everyone." A portion of his prostate had already been removed as part of treatment. His partner Lisa Hogan, who had taken an increasingly central role in both the farm and the show, thanked fans publicly for their support and posted updates from Diddley Squat while the news settled over the internet. The response was a reminder of something easy to forget about Jeremy Clarkson, that whatever the controversies, whatever the column inches, there is a vast community of people who feel a genuine, almost familial connection to him. Fan tributes flooded in. Piers Morgan urged men to get themselves checked. Former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak posted his good wishes. Former Top Gear fans who had been watching him for 30 years or more found themselves confronting the possibility of a world without him in a way that the steak Fracas or the BBC firing had never quite prompted. The man who had once seemed invincible, who had survived divorce, controversy, cancellation, and career collapse, was sitting in a muddy field in Oxfordshire, dealing with something he couldn't drive through, argue past, or joke away. When you trace the arc of Jeremy Clarkson's life from Doncaster to Diddley Squat, the through line is surprisingly consistent. A man of enormous talent and genuine warmth, wrapped in a persona built for maximum provocation, perpetually surprised by the consequences of his own behavior. The divorce that forms the centerpiece of this story wasn't just a painful personal chapter, it was the loose thread that, when pulled, unraveled nearly everything. The stress of that disintegrating marriage compounded every professional crisis. The professional crises compounded the personal grief. His mother's death, his cancer scare, his BBC war, none of these happened in isolation. They arrived together, in a cascading pileup, until one hungry, exhausted March evening in Yorkshire, the whole lot came apart in a hotel corridor. And yet, the version of Jeremy Clarkson that exists today, older, balder, genuinely fond of a sheep, running a farm shop in Oxfordshire and turning up to Cheltenham with mud on his boots, is in most measurable ways a more complete human being than the invincible Top Gear superstar at the height of his power. The farm gave him something that 350 million viewers never could: the experience of being genuinely accountable to something that didn't care about his opinions. Crops don't know who he is. Sheep are unimpressed by his Sunday Times column. The Oxfordshire Planning Authority has not been moved by his television credits. The marriage may have ended. The BBC career may have ended. The Grand Tour, after 8 years, has ended. 2 stents hold his arteries open. A surgery scar marks where the cancer was. But the work continues. The show continues. And in quiet moments on the farm at sunset, Jeremy Clarkson, expelled schoolboy, expelled TV presenter, accidental farmer, seems, for the first time in a very long career, to be exactly where he's supposed to be. Some crashes, it turns out, take you somewhere better than where you were heading. Until next time, stay tuned and stay sideways.